The world does not collapse overnight. A financial system, a nation's confidence, an empire's reach. All of them rot long before they fall. The illusion of stability is what makes collapse so deceptive. Right now, as you listen, the next global crisis is already gathering strength, not in the open arenas of politics and media, but in the silent spaces where most people never bother to look. This is how every storm begins, not with thunder that everyone hears, but with whispers only a few recognize. The current narrative, pushed across headlines and screens, paints a picture of resilience. Markets recover after shocks. Governments announce stability measures. International bodies release optimistic forecasts. People hear this and breathe easy, believing that the system is under control. But beneath this polished surface lies a set of fractures widening each day, concealed from the public eye. What is presented as calm is nothing more than a carefully staged performance to keep panic at bay. And yet the tremors underneath are too real to ignore. To understand how the next crisis is already brewing, one must look at the pattern of past collapses. The Great Depression, the oil shock of the 1970s, the Asian financial meltdown, the global crisis of 2008. Each of them followed the same pattern. There were always early warnings. There were always numbers, signals, and small-scale failures that hinted at the disaster to come. But most people missed them, not because they were blind, but because they were kept in the dark or told those signs were temporary. Today, history is repeating itself. The system is stretched thin in multiple directions. Debt levels, both public and private, have soared beyond what any economy can realistically sustain. Nations continue to borrow against futures they cannot guarantee. Corporations expand operations on credit that depends on fragile consumer confidence. Households live paycheck to paycheck, with little savings to withstand even minor shocks. Every layer of society is built upon borrowed time, and all it takes is one trigger to unravel the entire structure. Energy markets are another invisible battlefield. The public hears about oil prices rising or falling, but what they do not see is the underlying fragility in the supply chains. Entire regions depend on vulnerable transit routes. Any disruption, be it conflict, climate disaster, or political retaliation, can choke off supply, sending shockwaves across industries. The global economy is not diversified. It is dangerously interconnected. A single bottleneck can ripple across continents, paralyzing trade and production. This interdependence is not a strength. It is a weakness that waits for exploitation. Technology, often hailed as the savior, carries within it seeds of instability. The digital economy has made markets faster, but also more fragile. High-frequency trading algorithms can trigger collapses within minutes. Cyber vulnerabilities expose financial systems to attacks that can wipe out billions in value in hours. Ordinary citizens who rely on digital transactions, online banking, and automated supply systems are completely unprepared for what happens when these systems glitch or fail. And fail they will, not by accident, but as an inevitability of complexity. Food security, a topic often ignored in financial discussions, is another quiet fuse. The world's population continues to rise, but arable land shrinks under urban expansion and climate extremes. Agricultural systems are stretched thin, dependent on global trade flows that assume uninterrupted stability. A drought in one continent, a flood in another, a trade restriction imposed in response to conflict. All these can create sudden scarcity. Scarcity breeds panic, and panic destabilizes markets faster than any statistic can measure. The political sphere, too, contributes to this slow-burning crisis. Nations no longer operate under a shared vision of global cooperation. The world is fragmenting into blocks, each pursuing its own survival at the expense of others. Trade wars, currency devaluations, and sanctions may appear to be tactical moves, but they erode the foundations of trust that global commerce relies upon. The more nations retreat into protectionism, the more fragile the interconnected system becomes. This is not the path to stability. It is the road to fracture. The media speaks of resilience because the public craves reassurance. Stability sells calm. Panic destroys economies faster than the underlying crisis itself. This is why the narrative you're fed is always controlled. You're told that inflation is temporary, that supply chain disruptions are manageable, that unemployment will decline, that innovation will save growth. These are not truths. They are opiates designed to keep societies functioning until the inevitable arrives. The calm you feel is not real. It is engineered. Meanwhile, in boardrooms and closed-door conferences, the truth is acknowledged. Financial institutions quietly hedge against risks they publicly dismiss. Corporations relocate operations not because they trust in resilience, but because they anticipate collapse. Wealthy individuals diversify assets into land, precious metals, or offshore havens, while ordinary citizens are told to keep faith in the system. The powerful prepare for storms. They tell the masses do not exist. Consider the rising tension in currency markets. The global dominance of one currency has always been seen as the anchor of financial stability. But this dominance is now openly challenged. Nations quietly strike deals in alternative currencies, bypassing the system that has ruled for decades. The shift is slow, almost invisible to the casual observer, but it is happening, and when this shift reaches a tipping point, it will not be a gradual change. It will be a sudden rupture that leaves millions unprepared. The public is conditioned to believe crises arrive like earthquakes, sudden and predictable. The truth is more uncomfortable. Crises are slow-moving floods that people ignore until the water is at their necks. The next one has already started. It is in the inflation numbers that refuse to decline, the debts that cannot be repaid, the shortages that become more frequent, the protests that erupt in cities over costs of living. Each of these is a wave of the same rising flood, dismissed as temporary until it is too late to escape. The illusion of control is perhaps the most dangerous element. Governments continue to promise solutions. Central banks continue to assure stability, and corporations continue to project confidence. But none of them can alter the basic mathematics of reality. You cannot borrow indefinitely. You cannot consume endlessly. You cannot destroy trust and expect the system to function. Reality will correct these delusions, not with a whisper, but with a roar. And when that roar arrives, people will say it came suddenly, when in truth it had been building for years right before their eyes. The next crisis is not waiting for the future. It is already here. It is in the hidden weaknesses ignored by headlines, in the suppressed truths denied by officials, in the quiet preparations made by those who know what is coming. The only reason it has not yet exploded into full view is because those holding the strings still have an interest in delaying the reveal. But delayed does not mean prevention. It only means the eventual collapse will be sharper, deeper, and more merciless when it finally breaks through the surface. The most dangerous weapon in the world is not a missile nor an army, nor even an economic sanction. It is silence. Silence that is crafted, measured, and delivered with precision. When the media chooses not to tell you something, that silence is louder than the headlines they print. It is not what you are reading that keeps you calm. It is what you are not reading that keeps you blind. And right now, as the world inches toward the next great crisis, the silence is deafening. Turn on any channel, open any newspaper, scroll through any news feed, and you will see repetition. Inflation numbers, political scandals, market rebounds, celebrity distractions. It is all carefully curated noise. The stories are not untrue, but they are incomplete. Like a magician drawing your eyes to one hand while the other performs the trick. The media fills your attention with what is comfortable to consume while hiding the shadows that would change the way you think, act, or prepare. The silence is not accidental. It is designed. There's a reason for this. Panic is the enemy of order. If people knew the scale of what is already unraveling behind the curtain, they would change their behaviors overnight. They would withdraw savings, stop spending, hoard essentials, abandon trust in institutions. The system cannot survive such a collective reaction. So instead of truth, you're fed fragments. Instead of the whole picture, you are given outlines. And instead of urgency, you are pacified with reassurance. The selective silence is not about misinformation. It is about omission. Omission so precise that you remain convinced you know enough, when in fact you know almost nothing. Look at the financial world. You are told when markets rise or fall, when interest rates are adjusted, when central banks release their statements, but you are not told about the deeper structural weaknesses that make those announcements meaningless. Debt defaults quietly grow in corners of the system, never making headlines until they burst. Corporate bankruptcies are reported as isolated events, not as part of a pattern. The shadow banking sector, larger, riskier, and almost entirely unregulated, operates without scrutiny. Media outlets mention none of this in detail, because exposing it would reveal how fragile the global financial architecture really is. Energy crises are covered selectively as well. A sudden spike in oil prices makes news, but the long-term depletion of reserves is avoided. The shift of key nations securing private deals outside traditional markets is rarely given the attention it deserves. The growing vulnerability of power grids to cyber attacks is mentioned in passing, buried under layers of less urgent stories. The silence ensures that the average citizen never grasps the fragility of the systems keeping their homes lit, their cars fueled, and their industries. Food insecurity is another subject that lives in silence. Reports may highlight a drought in one country or a flood in another, but they never connect the dots. They do not show how interconnected agriculture has become, how one crop failure in one continent can ripple across supply chains, feeding millions elsewhere. They do not highlight how climate extremes are accelerating in frequency, threatening to disrupt harvests year after year. Instead, food stories are packaged as local, temporary issues rather than global red flags. The silence here prevents panic at supermarket shelves. Then there is the technological sphere. The media celebrates every breakthrough in artificial intelligence, robotics, and digital finance. Stories of innovation dominate, painting the future as one of convenience and progress. But missing from these reports are the vulnerabilities. The risks of entire economies becoming hostage to algorithms, the growing dependency on fragile digital infrastructure, the catastrophic potential of cyber warfare. These are barely whispered. The silence here ensures people continue to embrace systems that could collapse under pressure, unaware of the danger their reliance creates. Geopolitics may seem like an exception, with headlines full of wars, alliances, and rivalries. Yet even here, the silence is selective. When trade deals are broken, when nations quietly form economic blocs away from Western dominance, the coverage is muted. The realignment of global power is discussed only in diplomatic tones, never in terms of the existential risks it poses to the established order. The public sees conflict only as battles fought on distant soil, not as structural shifts that could determine the survival of entire economies. The silence shields them from the realization that global cooperation is breaking apart. One must also examine who controls the narrative. Media corporations do not exist in isolation. They are funded by advertisers, influenced by governments, and intertwined with financial interests. When those who own the presses and broadcast towers are themselves bound to the stability of the system, they will never risk exposing its true fragility. It is not that journalists cannot see the cracks. It is that the institutions they work for will not let them describe them in full. Silence is enforced not by ignorance, but by design. The selective silence also extends to how crises are explained once they emerge. When a market crashes, the headlines will attribute it to a sudden shock, a temporary miscalculation, or the actions of a few bad actors. Rarely will they admit that the crash was years in the making, rooted in structural flaws, ignored for too long. When an energy shortage strikes, it will be framed as the result of an unexpected disruption, not as the inevitable outcome of neglect and overdependence. When protests erupt over cost of living pressures, they will be labeled as local unrest, not as symptoms of a global system breaking down. The silence distorts not just the present, but also the history that explains it. People trust what they see on their screens. This trust is the most valuable commodity the system possesses, and it is protected by silence. As long as people believe they are informed, they remain compliant. They continue to consume, to borrow, to vote, to obey. Silence ensures they do not ask questions that could destabilize this rhythm. The truth is not hidden because it is unknown. It is hidden because it is dangerous. Dangerous not to the people, but to the institutions that thrive on their ignorance. Selective silence works hand in hand with distraction. Major stories break, scandals, celebrity controversies, political theater, and dominate headlines for weeks. During this time, critical developments in finance, trade, and energy receive little or no attention. The silence is not always about removal. Sometimes it is about burying. The important is hidden under the urgent. The significant is drowned in the entertaining. The result is the same. People know everything that does not matter and nothing that does. This silence is not static. It evolves with circumstances. In times of calm, it hides the cracks. In times of crisis, it hides the causes. And in times of recovery, it hides the truth that the recovery is fragile. This cycle repeats endlessly, ensuring the public never fully grasps the reality of their situation. They are always one step behind, reacting to events rather than preparing for them. Silence guarantees surprise, and surprise guarantees compliance. The media's selective silence is the reason the next crisis will appear sudden to the masses. It is not that the signs were invisible. It is that they were unspoken. It is not that the evidence was absent. It is that it was buried. People believe they are free because they can choose between channels, outlets, and platforms, but in reality, they are consuming variations of the same silence, packaged in different voices. The crisis is not invisible. It is silenced. Every great collapse is remembered for its final moment. The crash of the market, the fall of the government, the empty shelves, the riots in the streets. But what history books rarely highlight is how small, overlooked weaknesses light the fuse long before the explosion. The next crisis will not emerge from the causes people expect. It will not begin with the headline events the public believes to be decisive. Instead, it will ignite from hidden triggers, fragile points in the system that lie buried under layers of denial and distraction. These triggers are already in motion, and though they remain unseen by most, their impact will be catastrophic once they are activated. The public has been conditioned to believe in predictable causes. When people think of collapse, they imagine the stock market crashing, the housing bubble bursting, or a war breaking out. These are dramatic events, easy to visualize and easy to fear. But the truth is more unsettling. Collapses rarely begin with the obvious. The obvious is merely the symptom. The real cause lies beneath, in the places too small or too technical for the average citizen to notice, and too inconvenient for those in power to reveal. These hidden triggers are what turn cracks into earthquakes. One such trigger lies in the supply chain systems that fuel the global economy. People assume that shelves in stores will always be stocked, that goods will always arrive, and that shortages are temporary inconveniences. But the reality is that global trade flows are balanced on razor-thin margins. Shipping routes pass through fragile choke points, vulnerable to conflict, piracy, or even natural disasters. A single block passage can trap billions of dollars worth of goods, disrupting industries across continents. Even more alarming is the dependence on just-in-time delivery models, which leave no room for error. If a single point in the chain fails, the entire network begins to collapse like falling dominoes. Another hidden trigger exists within the banking systems. Banks are portrayed as pillars of strength, but in truth, they are leveraged far beyond what their public statements suggest. Most operate on the assumption that depositors will not withdraw funds all at once. This confidence keeps the system alive. Yet beneath the surface, banks are entangled in risky loans, fragile derivatives, and exposure to assets that are worth far less than claimed. A single wave of defaults or a sudden loss of confidence can set off a chain reaction that brings institutions down. The public will be told it was sudden, but the weakness was always there, hidden, ignored, and waiting. Corporate debt is another silent fault line. Many corporations, even some of the most celebrated, are drowning in borrowed money. They expand operations, buy back shares, and pay dividends, not from strength, but from debt that assumes endless growth. When consumer demand falters or interest rates rise, these corporations face a reckoning. Their defaults do not remain isolated. They spread across suppliers, employees, and investors. What looks like the fall of a single company quickly becomes a systemic collapse because the debt web is woven into every layer of the economy. Technology, often seen as the savior, harbors triggers of its own. The dependence on algorithms, automation, and artificial intelligence has created a system that moves faster than human control. Markets are now vulnerable to flash crashes, triggered by a single glitch in code or an unforeseen interaction between trading programs. Entire economies can lose billions in minutes, not because of deliberate sabotage, but because of the hidden complexity no one fully understands. Worse still, cyber attacks have become the new weapons of war, capable of crippling financial institutions, power grids, and communication networks. One successful strike could paralyze a nation, and the public would never have seen it coming. The hidden triggers extend to natural resources. Water scarcity, long ignored, is a distant concern, is rapidly becoming a present danger. Entire regions are draining aquifers, faster than they can be replenished. Climate extremes worsen the problem, turning fertile land into dust. Once water scarcity reaches critical levels, it will not only spark humanitarian crises, but also geopolitical conflicts. Wars may not start with soldiers. They may start with rivers running dry. This kind of trigger does not announce itself with headlines until it is too late to reverse. Currency systems, too, hide silent detonators. The dominance of a global reserve currency has long been taken for granted, but the shift toward alternative arrangements is accelerating. Bilateral trade deals that bypass traditional financial structures may seem insignificant individually, but collectively they weaken the foundation of the current monetary order. When confidence in a currency erodes, it does not fade gradually. It vanishes all at once. This sudden collapse of trust becomes a hidden trigger that can destabilize global markets overnight. Even social dynamics hold concealed points of failure. Rising inequality, mass unemployment, and generational discontent are often treated as political talking points rather than systemic risks. But history shows that societies collapse when the gap between the powerful and the powerless becomes unbearable. Discontent simmers quietly, dismissed by leaders and ignored by media, until it explodes in waves of unrest. Protests, strikes, and riots are not random. They are triggered by long-ignored injustices. The true collapse is not just economic, but social, and it begins in the silence of ignored voices. Health systems are another fragile link in the chain. The recent global pandemic revealed how unprepared even the strongest nations are for sustained crises. While the world congratulates itself for surviving, the underlying vulnerabilities remain. Supply chains for medicines are concentrated in a few regions. Hospitals are understaffed and underfunded. Public health surveillance is inconsistent. Another outbreak, even less deadly but more disruptive, could shatter economies already on edge. This is not speculation. It is a hidden trigger waiting to emerge from the pressure of global movement and environmental change. Each of these triggers, taken alone, may appear manageable. A delayed shipment, a corporate bankruptcy, a localized drought, a brief market glitch, none of these seem capable of bringing the world to its knees. But the danger lies not in isolation. It lies in connection. The global system is so tightly woven that one weak thread can unravel the entire fabric. A shipping delay leads to manufacturing halts. A corporate bankruptcy leads to mass unemployment. A drought leads to rising food prices, which spark unrest. Each trigger cascades into the next, accelerating the collapse beyond the ability of leaders to respond. The greatest irony is that the very design of modern systems makes them more fragile, not less. Efficiency has been prioritized over resilience. Globalization has created dependence rather than independence. Technology has accelerated reactions but not reduced risks. Leaders have built structures that work perfectly in calm times but collapse instantly under stress. The hidden triggers are not mistakes. They are the inevitable result of chasing short-term gains at the expense of long-term stability. The next crisis will not begin with the events most people expect. It will not start with a headline war or a dramatic market crash. It will start quietly with a seemingly minor failure in a system few pay attention to. A container ship stuck in a channel, a cyber attack on a bank no one considered essential, a sudden drought in a region most people never think about. These events, ignored by the majority, will set off chains of collapse that no one can stop once they begin. The hidden triggers are already here, embedded deep within the fragile web of global interdependence, waiting for the moment when stress, chance, or negligence sets them off. Global power has always been presented as something solid, something unshakable. Nations build their prestige on military strength, technological dominance, and financial control, projecting an image of permanence. Citizens are told that their governments are strong, their alliances secure, and their economies resilient. Yet beneath a polished surface lies a far more fragile reality. The uncomfortable truth about global power is that it is not as stable as people are led to believe. It is a balancing act maintained by perception, confidence, and narratives, rather than unbreakable foundations. And this balance is now beginning to tilt. Power is not only about armies, weapons, and territory. True power lies in influence, the ability to shape the rules of the game and have others obey them. For decades, one global system has dominated trade, finance, and politics. Its currency has served as the standard, its markets have been the center, and its cultural exports have shaped the world. But this dominance is no longer absolute. Quietly, nations are building alternatives, forming alliances outside traditional structures, and creating systems that bypass the old order. These shifts do not make headlines every day, but they are steadily eroding the monopoly of power that once seemed untouchable. The fragile nature of power becomes visible when one examines the foundations of global trade. Supply chains stretch across continents, built on the assumption that cooperation will remain intact. But the truth is that cooperation is crumbling. Sanctions, tariffs, and protectionist policies are rising. Nations once willing to integrate are now prioritizing self-preservation. The system depends on trust, yet trust is vanishing. When a nation decides it no longer needs to play by the old rules, the balance of power weakens. And once others follow, the shift accelerates. Power that seemed permanent reveals itself to be conditional. Energy is another key to understanding the fragility of power. Control over oil and gas has long given certain nations leverage over others. Wars have been fought, alliances formed, and economies shaped by the flow of energy. Yet the landscape is changing. Alternative energy sources, new trade deals, and technological shifts are undermining the old order. At the same time, conflicts over pipelines, reserves, and transit routes expose how vulnerable the system is. A single disruption can upend not just markets, but entire governments. Those who once wielded power through energy now find their grip loosening, while others rise to challenge them. The truth is that power tied to finite resources cannot last indefinitely. Currency dominance has been one of the most significant pillars of global power. A single currency has ruled international trade for decades, giving its nation unmatched influence. But cracks are appearing. Nations are signing agreements to trade in their own currencies, bypassing the global standard. Central banks are diversifying reserves, quietly reducing their dependence. These actions may seem small in isolation, but collectively, they represent a slow rebellion against the established order. If confidence in the dominant currency collapses, its power collapses with it. That collapse will not come gradually. It will come suddenly in a wave of rejection that leaves no time for recovery. Military might, often seen as the ultimate guarantor of power, also hides its weaknesses. Massive defense budgets and advanced technology create the illusion of invincibility. Yet, modern conflicts reveal a different truth. Smaller nations using unconventional strategies have repeatedly challenged larger powers, Cyber warfare, guerrilla tactics, and asymmetric conflicts expose how brute force no longer guarantees victory. The balance of global power is not as simple as counting missiles or ships. It is about adaptability, resilience, and perception. A single defeat, even symbolic, can shatter the illusion of dominance that took decades to build. Technology, too, plays a paradoxical role in power. On one hand, it is a tool of control, allowing surveillance, communication dominance, and global reach. On the other hand, it is also a weakness. The more interconnected a nation becomes, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. Cyber attacks, data breaches, and system failures reveal that technological superiority can be turned against its owner. Power that depends on fragile systems is not secure power. It is a borrowed stability, one that can vanish the moment those systems are compromised. Another uncomfortable truth is that power is deeply tied to perception. A nation may be struggling internally, its debts unsustainable, its people restless, its industries declining. Yet if the world believes it is strong, it continues to wield influence. Conversely, when perception changes, power evaporates quickly. The collapse of empires in history shows this clearly. Rome did not fall in a single battle. It fell when its aura of invincibility faded. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of one war. It collapsed because people stopped believing in its permanence. Today's powers are no different. Their strength is as much about belief as it is about reality. Once that belief cracks, so does their influence. Social unrest is another silent force, eroding power. Leaders may project authority abroad, but if their citizens no longer trust them, their foundation weakens. Rising inequality, declining opportunities, and growing discontent are eating away at the legitimacy of governments around the world. A power structure can appear solid while rotting from within. The people at the bottom of the pyramid often hold the key to its stability, and when their patience runs out, even the mightiest structures collapse. This is not just theory. It is the recurring lesson of history. Geopolitical realignments further expose the instability of power. Nations that once cooperated under a single system are now breaking away, forming new blocs and alliances. The East builds its own financial and technological structures. The South seeks independence from the North's dictates. This fragmentation is irreversible. The old centers of power can no longer dictate terms without resistance. Every new alliance outside the established order chips away at the dominance of those who once controlled everything. The truth is that global power is decentralizing, and those clinging to past dominance are fighting a battle they cannot win. Perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is that global power is cyclical. No empire, no currency, no alliance has ever lasted forever. Each believed it was different. Each convinced itself of eternal dominance, but the pattern has never broken. From Mesopotamia to Rome, from the Ottomans to the British Empire, from the Cold War blocs to today's system, the story is always the same. Power accumulates, reaches its peak, and then declines. What makes this moment different is the speed. Technology, globalization, and interconnection ensure that decline, once it begins, will happen faster than in any previous era. The world is standing at a threshold where the balance of power is already shifting. The pillars that hold it together, currency, energy, military, perception, and alliances, are all under strain. The public narrative continues to emphasize stability, dominance, and resilience. Yet behind closed doors, those in power acknowledge the fragility. They diversify assets, secure alternative trade routes, and prepare for disruptions they never speak of publicly. The uncomfortable truth about global poor is that it is not fixed, not eternal, and not immune to collapse. It is a fragile construction of belief, resources, and control that is now being tested in ways it has not been tested before. Crises never remain contained. They may begin in one corner of the world, with one sector, one industry, or even one decision. But the consequences ripple outward until they touch every household, every worker, and every community. This is the essence of the domino effect, the unstoppable chain reaction that transforms a single weakness into a global disaster. The danger of the next crisis does not lie merely in its starting point, but in how quickly it will spread, pulling down one structure after another until the illusion of stability vanishes. The domino effect operates because the modern world is more interconnected than any period in history. Economies, markets, and nations are tied together by trade, finance, energy, and technology. A farmer in one country depends on fertilizers shipped from another. A factory in one region cannot operate without parts manufactured halfway across the globe. A bank in one city is entangled in debts owed by institutions in multiple nations. Each piece relies on the other, and when one falls, the chain of collapse begins. What once would have been a localized issue now becomes a global shock. Consider the housing collapse of 2008. It began with defaults on mortgages in specific regions of one country. To the average person, it seemed like a local problem. But those mortgages had been bundled into securities, sold across the world, and tied into the balance sheets of banks everywhere. When the first domino fell, the entire global financial system followed. That collapse was not a singular event. It was the visible tipping point of a chain reaction set in motion long before. The next crisis will follow the same pattern, but with even greater speed, because the world has only grown more interdependent. Debt is one of the most dangerous dominoes in this chain. Governments borrow to cover deficits. Corporations borrow to fuel expansion, and households borrow to survive. As long as credit flows, the system appears to function. But when repayment falters, defaults spread like wildfire. A missed payment by one institution causes panic among lenders, who then withdraw credit from others. What began as an isolated problem cascades into a wave of bankruptcies, layoffs, and foreclosures. The domino effect of debt does not stop at financial institutions. It ripples into every corner of daily life. Supply chains form another fragile sequence. Imagine a single factory that produces critical components for industries worldwide. If that factory shuts down due to conflict, disaster, or policy change, production lines in dozens of countries grind to a halt. Automakers cannot assemble vehicles. Electronics companies cannot release new devices, and medical equipment cannot be produced on schedule. This single disruption leads to unemployment, lost revenue, and rising prices. Consumers face shortages, inflation surges, and governments scramble to respond. The domino effect ensures that one missing piece of the puzzle affects the entire picture. Energy is no less vulnerable. Disruption in oil or gas supply from one region creates immediate ripples across global markets. Prices spike, transportation costs rise, and entire industries dependent on affordable energy falter. Countries that import fuel see their currencies weaken as they spend more on energy bills. This leads to inflation, social unrest, and political instability. The dominoes fall quickly from energy suppliers to manufacturers, from manufacturers to retailers, and from retailers to consumers. A single disruption in energy becomes a crisis of livelihoods. Food security represents another set of dominoes waiting to collapse. Agricultural production is dependent on climate, trade, fertilizers, and transport. A drought in one country may reduce harvests, but the impact does not stop there. Global grain markets rise, affecting bread prices thousands of miles away. When basic staples become unaffordable, protests erupt. Governments struggle to maintain control, and instability spreads. The domino effect of food shortages has already been seen in history, where rising food prices contributed to revolutions and uprisings. The next crisis may again be triggered not by bombs or markets, but by empty stomachs. Technology adds yet another fragile chain. Modern economies rely on digital systems to process payments, manage logistics, and run businesses. A cyber attack or system failure in one critical hub can paralyze entire regions. Banks may freeze, supply chains may lose tracking capabilities, and hospitals may lose access to patient records. The dominoes fall rapidly because the digital world is designed for efficiency, not resilience. Once the first system fails, interconnected networks follow, spreading disruption far beyond the original point of attack. The domino effect is not only economic or technological, it is social as well. When people lose jobs due to corporate bankruptcies, they cut spending, lower consumer demand, forces other companies to reduce production, leading to more layoffs. As unemployment grows, governments face pressure to provide assistance, but their budgets are already strained by debt. Citizens grow angry, protests break out, and political instability rises. This chain reaction transforms an economic issue into a social and political crisis. The dominoes of despair do not fall in isolation. They collide, each amplifying the next. One of the most overlooked aspects of the domino effect is psychological. Confidence is the invisible glue holding systems together. Banks function because depositors trust their money is safe. Currencies retain value because people believe in them. Governments maintain order because citizens accept their authority. When that trust is shaken, the dominoes fall faster than any economic model can predict. A single failed institution can cause millions to panic, rushing to withdraw funds, hoard goods, or abandon investments. This mass reaction accelerates collapse far beyond the original trigger. History offers countless examples of how dominoes of collapse cascade across borders. The Asian financial crisis of the 1990s began with the fall of one currency, but spread across entire regions. The Great Depression began with a market crash, but turned into a global economic catastrophe. The Arab Spring began with protests over basic needs, but spread into revolutions across nations. Each event showed that no crisis remains isolated. Once the first domino falls, the rest cannot help but follow. Today's system is even more vulnerable because the dominoes are closer together than ever before. Financial markets operate in real time, supply chains are global, and news travels instantly. A disruption in one place is felt across the world within hours. Unlike past collapses that took months or years to spread, the next crisis will move at the speed of technology. The dominoes are not just aligned, they are wired together, ensuring that the fall is swift, brutal, and inescapable. The true danger of the domino effect lies in its unpredictability. No one can know which domino will fall first. It could be a debt default, a cyber attack, an energy disruption, or a political breakdown. What matters is not the trigger, but the chain it unleashes. The interconnectedness of the modern world ensures that once the sequence begins, it will not stop until it has run its course. The illusion of stability will vanish, and people will realize that the entire system was only as strong as its weakest link. There are moments in history when warnings are whispered, when signals appear faint, and when the majority dismiss them as exaggerations. And then there are moments when the warning is no longer subtle, when the evidence is overwhelming, and when ignoring it becomes an act of self-destruction. Right now, the world stands at such a moment. The urgent wake-up call has already been sounded, not in the headlines you are fed, but in the patterns unfolding around you, in the silent shifts that are reshaping the future without permission. To ignore these signals is to walk willingly into the storm unprepared. An urgent wake-up call is not meant to soothe, it is meant to disturb. It exists to force people out of their illusions and confront realities that are uncomfortable, inconvenient, and often terrifying. The next crisis will not wait for people to feel ready. It will not knock politely on the door. It will strike when most are distracted, lulled into complacency by assurances that everything is under control. The wake-up call is not for those who manage the system. They already know what is coming and are quietly preparing. It is for those who live inside the illusion, convinced that their safety is guaranteed by forces that are anything but secure. To understand why the call is urgent, one must look at the signals hiding in plain sight. Prices rise faster than wages, but this is explained away as temporary. Debt balloons across governments, corporations, and households. But this is dismissed as manageable. Supply chains buckle under strain, yet this is packaged as minor disruption. Each of these is a clear sign that the system is fraying. Yet the media, the institutions, and the leaders cover these truths with language designed to pacify. The urgency exists not because the crisis is distant, but because it is already unfolding, disguised as normalcy. This call is also urgent because of the speed with which collapse can now spread. In previous eras, crises took months or years to ripple across borders. Today, with digital systems, instant communication, and globalized supply chains, the spread is measured in hours and days. A bank default in one region can shake markets worldwide before the sun rises elsewhere. A cyber attack on critical infrastructure can paralyze multiple nations at once. A trade restriction imposed overnight can leave millions facing shortages the next morning. The urgency lies in the compression of time. The distance between trigger and collapse has never been shorter. Another dimension of urgency comes from the widening gap between those who know and those who do not. In boardrooms, policy circles, and elite networks, preparations are already underway. Wealth is being shifted into safer assets, offshore accounts, land and commodities that cannot vanish overnight. Contingency plans are drawn in case currencies collapse or markets freeze. Yet the ordinary citizen is told to carry on, to trust in stability, to believe that everything is under control. The wake-up call exists because this imbalance of knowledge is a form of betrayal. Those at the top prepare while those at the bottom are left blind. The wake-up call is also about the fragility of trust. Every institution relies on faith. Faith in banks to protect deposits, in governments to provide order, in currencies to retain value, in supply chains to deliver goods. Once that faith cracks, collapse accelerates. The urgency is to recognize that trust is already eroding. People sense the instability even if they cannot name it. They see rising costs, feel the pressure of debt, and witness the decline in standards of living. They suspect something deeper is wrong, but they are reassured that recovery is around the corner. The wake-up call exists to strip away that false reassurance and reveal that faith alone cannot stop the unraveling. This call is urgent because crises do not punish equally. The wealthy and powerful with resources and foresight can shield themselves. They own multiple homes, diversify assets, and maintain networks of protection. Ordinary families, however, live paycheck to paycheck, dependent on systems that failed them first. When collapse comes, it is the working class, the vulnerable, and the forgotten who face the sharpest consequences. This is why the wake-up call matters, because those least prepared are the ones who will suffer most, and they are precisely the ones told nothing is wrong. Another aspect of urgency lies in the illusion of recovery. After every crisis, leaders promise reforms and stability. Yet instead of addressing the roots, they patch the symptoms, printing more money to cover debts, offering temporary subsidies to mask inflation, or shifting blame to external enemies. These are not solutions, they are delays. Each delay makes the eventual collapse deeper. The wake-up call is not about the crisis beginning someday in the future. It is about the reality that the foundation is already cracking, while people are told to celebrate small victories. The wake-up call also emphasizes that the triggers of collapse are not dramatic at the start. They are subtle, almost invisible. A misshipment, a delayed payment, a cyber glitch, a political announcement that seems insignificant. These sparks, dismissed as minor, ignite the larger fire. The urgency is to recognize that small events now carry outsized consequences because of the fragile, interconnected nature of the system. Waiting for a grand explosion before paying attention is the mistake that leaves people blindsided. Beyond economics and politics, the wake-up call is also about the social unraveling that accompanies crises. When prices soar and jobs vanish, people lose patience. Protests erupt, crime rises, and governments tighten control. Freedoms are curtailed in the name of order, and surveillance expands in the name of safety. The urgent warning here is not only about markets, but about the erosion of liberties and the rise of authoritarian responses. The crisis will not only empty wallets, it will reshape societies. The wake-up call demands recognition that survival is not just financial, it is also social and political. The urgency also comes from the inevitability of denial. People do not like to face uncomfortable truths. They cling to normalcy, convincing themselves that tomorrow will look like yesterday. This denial delays preparation, leaving people exposed when the storm arrives. The wake-up call exists precisely because denial is the most dangerous reaction. Those who refuse to see will be hit hardest, while those who prepare even modestly stand a chance to endure. History provides endless reminders of missed wake-up calls. Empires ignored the signs of their decline until invaders breached their gates. Economies dismissed inflation until currencies became worthless. Societies ignored inequality until revolutions erupted. Each time, the signs were visible. Each time, the majority chose comfort over truth. Each time, the cost of ignorance was catastrophic. The urgent wake-up call today is no different. The signs are visible. The silence is deliberate. The choice to prepare or ignore rests with individuals. The final element of urgency lies in the speed of transformation. Once the crisis fully ignites, the world people know will change irreversibly. Jobs, currencies, borders, freedoms, none of these are guaranteed to remain as they are. The wake-up call is not about fear for its own sake. It is about recognizing that the window for preparation is closing. The time to act is not when the collapse is in full view. By then, it will be too late. The urgency is now in this moment, while the signs are still whispers rather than screams.